Hi there. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at basic color correction in Premiere. So in our overtime project, especially in the second half of it, there are a couple of shots that I think are useful shots, but are badly in need of color correction. They've never been color corrected out of the camera. They don't match any of the other shots that they would be right next to. One example, probably one of the standout ones, is the very last shot. There are a number of takes of it that have been color corrected, and you can use any of those, but for the sake of a teaching moment, I do think that the one that is not color corrected is really good in terms of timing and camera and performance. It's just, here's what it looks like coming straight out of the file, right? So that is not this. So, can we get anywhere close to that is going to be our challenge. So I'll try to show you what tools we have available to us in Premiere to do that kind of thing. There's also another moment here. There's a couple of insert close-ups of locking the door. When our hero, such as he is, gets home, he triple locks his door, and the first two look like they're inside a dark house with no lights on, but this one looks much different. This is with no color correction on it. So we go dark, dark, much brighter. And so I want to see if we can pull this one down. This one is a little bit easier than the close-up with the werewolf teeth. So we'll start here as a way of learning, and then we'll get a little more complicated there. So when doing color correction in Premiere, I would go to the Effects tab, which is down here, and grab the Lumetri color, which is under Video Effects, Color Correction, and then I'm clicking and dragging that over to the relevant clip. Now, I already have a finished one on here, and as you can see, you can kind of tick this FX icon on and off to bypass an effect that you've already got. So this is where I arrived at already, having done this before the tutorial. And let's see if I can remake it here live on camera. So this particular effect it's kind of thorough. There's a lot of options in it, and they all twirl open here. They're in categories. All we'll touch on this one is basic correction, but there are also a lot of other ways you can go about it. There's a creative section for more color grading, like for style, looks kind of thing. Curves, which does things more graph oriented. There's a color wheels and matching section. We'll use that on the face. Then there's a hue, saturation, lightness section, and vignetting to put kind of darkness around the edges. But we're going to stay here on basic correction. So I'm just going to twirl this open, and we've got plenty to adjust just right here. So in general, all of these number sliders on basic correction are going to deal with color or lightness or darkness or some combination of both. I'm skipping a couple of things at the top. We're not doing a high dynamic range project, so that's irrelevant for us. You can use LUTs, which are I guess think of them as sort of like color correction presets. They're often based on a particular camera or film stock, and they can bring in a sort of pat look. But that'd be more appropriate for if you'd shot your own, footage and you were trying to give it all a different look than it had coming out of the camera. We're trying to do kind of like a custom correction on this footage to match what's next to it. So I'm going to skip all this and just get right down to business here. The first two that I want to point you to are color-oriented sliders. Temperature is essentially adjusting white balance. It goes from orange, warm, kind of tungsten on one end to blue on the other. Of course, I showed you the extremes, but what we would actually be using it for is to slightly warm up or slightly cool down an image. You can also auto white balance by using this eyedropper, clicking it, and then clicking on something that's supposed to be white, and it can white balance based on that. So that's actually a pretty good white balance right there, but I don't think that I want this to be white balanced quite so well, because look how blue these shots are, and I think that sells nighttime a little better. So if anything, I want to cheat this down into the cool a little bit more than it wants to be naturally. Tint takes you on the other axis of color, green and magenta. So we go more magenta if we turn it up, we go more green if we turn it down. Using both of these in combination, you can get to your yellows or your purples or whatever by combining the colors. But I don't think we need to push this to the green or the magenta in our current goal. All right, so then we get down to each of these deals with value, lightness, darkness, contrast between the two. And it deals with it in different ways. So exposure has a slider that essentially tries to simulate having higher or lower exposure setting coming from the camera. While it can't do absolute magic, I think that in part we do want to just knock down the exposure a little bit here. Next you have contrast, which most folks I think would have a familiarity with. Less contrast means that the darks aren't going to be as dark, the lights aren't going to be as light, everything's going to sort of shift towards middle gray. More contrast means the darks are going to be very dark, the lights are going to be very light, and there won't be much in the middle. I think here let's compare back. We probably do want a little more contrast, but I also want to make sure I get the highlights knocked down. So you'll see on the next slider, that's highlights, and highlights can either go hotter or knocked down. I don't want to go too extreme here to make it look fake, but I do think that we need to knock these highlights down a little bit. Shadows, as they turn up, they are brighter, so you could get a lot more out of this image if you were trying to brighten it up, but we're not. We're trying to darken it. So shadows should probably go down into the dark as well. And then the last two here are whites and blacks. Now you might think shadows and highlights, right? We already did that. Whites and blacks are sort of the more extreme end of the spectrum, where highlights, affects the wood grain, everything that's sort of a highlight of any kind. White is the more extreme version of that, so we're just talking about the lightest lights. So here I think we can knock down the whites, maybe gain a little back in the highlights then, because I'd love to get this down without losing too much in here. And then the blacks, if we make the blacks really black, I mean, you can make the whole image go away. If they're really light, you've sort of overexposed the blacks versus kind of crushed the low end of the image here. So we're gonna kind of rough that in and pop back and forth and see. So it looks like the black in this image goes all the way black, so that's fine here. And then where we do have highlights, they're a little bit knocked down. I think we've done a pretty good job. So this is what we've got and that's what it used to be. So this is a great tool just to toggle on and off to be like, where, like after you've messed with that for so long, you might think, how much did I actually change? And then you look at it and you're like, wow, that was really bright. Because if this is still looking good to me, and look how dark I've made it, this was really bright. Now, there's one thing that I did in the original one. Like this was my first settings as a demo. There's one thing that I did that we haven't talked about yet, and that's down here past these auto buttons, there's the saturation slider. And while these were all about lightness and darkness, this goes back to color again. So saturation is a scale that on the low end means you're completely in grayscale, black and white, no color at all. On the high end, your colors are like, you know, Crayola crayon colors, like they're saturated, they're colorful colors. So I think that my thinking was that the wood of the door is too brown compared to here, where it's more of a grayed out brown. I'm not seeing nearly as much brownness to the browns in this, whereas here it's a richer brown. So I'm thinking, even though that's pretty, it's not matching, so we need to knock down the saturation a bit. Not all the way to black and white, because we're not trying to make a style piece here, but I do want some of that brown gone. So now this door looks more like it could believably be the same door, but we're still in color. So this is my color correction. That's where it was, this is where it is. Okay, great. So we've saved that one, made it fit in much better with the image. This one is tougher, because this is essentially what we're cutting from. You know, our character is just about to fully turn into a werewolf. We punch in with a kind of jump cut sequence, and then he opens his contact lens werewolf eyes and shows us his teeth. And that's the end. Now, if I decide, you know, for the sake of argument, that I simply must have this take, then we have to save its color, because this just looks so different, right? That it knocks us out of it, especially as the last shot of the film. So we've got to do something here. In general, my plan is I have to get way darker. We have to bring the shadows out, because this is like, you know, very raw, and in this situation overexposed, and it's also not saturated enough, right? This is very flesh tone, whereas here he's really warm, you know, very orange, very pink. So we're gonna see what we can do about that. This is what I arrived at before, so it's possible to get, you know, pretty close. Like, that's not too bad, especially considering where we were coming from. But let's try it together, and I'll show you what my thinking was. So we're going to start with the basic color correction. I think that the color temperature here needs to go warmer, not this warm, but certainly not any bluer than we are. So I'm going to start by warming it up a little bit. I also think that we could potentially make use of the tint here, not tons, but I'm looking at his cheeks in this shot and seeing some red that I don't know if I'll be able to get back without introducing a little bit of red into the skin tone here. Exposure has to come down a little bit. But that doesn't change our contrast between light and the light areas and the shadow areas. For that, we need to introduce contrast. We need to bring the highlights up. We need to bring the shadows down. Any whites such as there are should probably be heightened. Blacks come down a bit. So now we're getting a lot closer to something that you could imagine using. It's still not right color-wise, but in terms of the value, that is to say the darkness or lightness, we're getting somewhere, right? Now the danger when you have to make extreme changes is that you can get to the point where your image gets really pixelated, or the colors get really crushed. You get a lot of banding. You can see that if I turn down the shadows really, or the black really extreme way. So we can't get carried away. But now that I've introduced, shadow back into this image, we might go back into the color temperature and the tint and see if we can do more with that. But this is where I want to take us to another section and show you that you can have more fine-tuned control under the color wheels and matching section. So under the color wheels, we can, there's two options here. You can make a comparison view and bring up like a reference. This is one of the other takes that was color corrected, so we could go with that and try to match their work. We could also jump back and just be like, well, whatever they did, it doesn't really matter. I need to look at what I'm cutting from, right? So I'm cutting between this shot and this shot. So, this is my goal. And then you can try to auto, but as you can see, it went way off base there. I can try it again on something that's much more similar to try to apply a match. That's not too bad. Not too bad. So if you were like, okay, that's as far as I want to go, we would get, we'd have done a pretty good job. But if you want to take a look at how you use this without doing auto, what we're looking at here is these represent the color of shadows, the color of midtones, and the color of highlights. And so what's nice about this is you can separately sort of push tint or color temperature for each of those sections. So this is my result. This is what I'm trying to get towards. And what I notice is that in my midtones, I'm too yellow. It's like orangey, murky, mustard yellow. And so when you look at a color wheel, you can think about it in two ways. One way is, oh, I want to make something more yellow, so I push it towards the yellow. The center plus sign is like where we are now. If you click and drag that plus, I can make it more yellow by pushing it towards the yellow. But you can also think of it as pulling away from. So I can pull away from the yellow. Now, you'll notice that means we're pushing towards the blue. So if you go too extreme, stuff turns blue. But if I'm saying, okay, my midtones are too yellow, and I want them to be less yellow, I need to go away from the yellow, and if anything, I'd like them to be a little more magenta than they are. So maybe there. Remember, if you go extreme, it becomes pretty cartoonish pretty fast. Highlights, sometimes you just want to push it to see, like what happens if. But here, I think my highlights actually do want them to remain a little yellow. And then the shadows, interestingly, I think mine look a little better than theirs here. But I guess maybe they wanted, less darkness. They wanted to see both eyes. So, fair enough. But I think ours are redder than theirs. And so we could potentially try to pull away from the red, push a little more towards the green, just subtly, and stay more in the earth tones than in the red tones. The other thing you can do is over here on the sliders, this is going to be another way that you can handle the brightness or darkness of shadows. I think that is a little much. I think we dealt with it pretty well before. But here's my result, and let's take off the comparison view and remind ourselves of where we were before. So if you think like, oh, that's pretty good, but I wish it were, just pat yourself on the back. Look at this, right? Like that's unusable, and this looks like a real shot, and it would cut together pretty convincingly with that. Not perfect, still to me a little too orange, but good enough for rock and roll. So that's the basics on how you deal with color correction in Adobe Premiere. If you get excited about color correction and color grading, which is the more creative and style side of doing color work, we have an entire semester-long class on color correction and grading that you should look up using DaVinci Resolve, which is a piece of software that's the industry standard for this work. But even just working in Premiere, you can get an awful lot done to fix images that are otherwise unusable, or to just give them more of a look in keeping with the rest of your footage.